コファスアジアパシフィック地域カルロス・カサノバエコノミストより日本の貿易相手国に関するカントリーリスクとセクターリスク評価をテーマにお話ししていただきます。お願いいたします。
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. I have the pleasure to be the last speaker today before the panel. I'm sure you're all quite tired from all the great economic presentations that we've had. I also have a very short period of time to cover our country and sector risk assessments for the whole world. That means I cannot cover everything in detail. Luckily, we have some great speakers that have talked about some of the most relevant developments in the global economy, so I don't have to talk about those. But I do want to discuss something important with you. Now, if you will forget everything I say but one thing, I would like you to take home with you this image. This is a pendulum, and in a way it reflects what's going on in the global economy at the moment. We've seen how the rhetoric and the narrative surrounding global growth has improved significantly in this year. Remember that in the first quarter of the year, the IMF published a very shy report entitled Gaining Momentum with a big question mark. And that was followed by a series of updates by the IMF and the World Bank that were increasingly assertive in the tone. The final one of those updates by the IMF is actually entitled A Firm Recovery. So you can see how that evolves over the period of this year. However, in our opinion, this is just the culmination of a series of cyclical factors that have brought global growth up, and they will start to fade going into the future, bringing everything down. So I'm going to walk you through that today. Of course, Japan's benefited significantly from some of these cyclical factors, primarily because they affect some of Japan's major trade partners. We're talking the United States, 20% of Japan's total exports go to the US, 18% go to China, 10% to the Eurozone, and 7% to South Korea. So as you'll see in the following slides, a series of cyclical factors has led to an improvement in those economies, and that's translated into better growth in Japan as well, but we have to remain cautiously optimistic. So the global economic recovery is synchronized along all of the major economies. In the US, we have full employment. In fact, there's a positive gap between structural unemployment and the unemployment as forecasted by the OECD. And that's greatly benefited domestic demand, which has also favored exports from Asian exporting powerhouses such as Japan. However, especially in the recent months, we've seen a deterioration of key activity indicators in the United States that point towards a potential correction or like a downturn in the current business cycle. For example, building permits, vehicle sales, and industrial profits were down in the United States. And President Trump might be able to postpone the demise or the decline of that business cycle a little bit if he does fiscal stimulus. However, any aggressive form of fiscal stimulus is likely to be counterbalanced by faster interest rate hikes by the Fed to try to address that fiscal imbalance. And so we find it highly unlikely that additional demand from the US will continue into the future. In the Eurozone, again, we've seen sentiment indicators at an all-time high. PMIs for all of the countries in the region, including Spain, that country's been in the news quite a lot recently, are at very high levels. But political risks haven't completely disappeared. So last year we were all worried about what I mentioned before, these black swan scenarios materializing. In France with Le Pen, luckily that did not happen. In Germany with the nationalist right, and in Italy as well. But they haven't completely dissipated. So we actually calculate that the risks of succession in the Spanish economy could translate into a minus 1.5 correction in GDP growth, which would cumulatively bring down Eurozone GDP by about 0.4%, which of course could impact Japanese demand. And the third, one of the major economies where we've seen quite a lot of growth stabilization in the past months, but we'll go into it in more detail, is China. Now, this recovery is not only synchronized amongst the major economies, it's also been affected some of the major sectors. In this chart, you will see the correlation between added value by sector and GDP for a very long period of time between 1980 and 2017. And you can see that some sectors are more highly correlated than the others. It also happens that the sectors on the right-hand side of the chart are pro-cyclical, while those on the left-hand side of the chart are counter-cyclical. So you have things like metal products and mining, oil, chemicals, and refining improving from pro-cyclical effects like we have seen in the past months, whereas other sectors that are counter-cyclical, like education, healthcare, etc., have not received as much benefit. Now, if there is a pro-cyclical decline in economic activities, governments can always increase fiscal spending on counter-cyclical sectors. However, you can see the correlation is much larger for pro-cyclical sectors, so it's unlikely that even like increasing expenditures on things like education. I think there's a discussion in Japan at the moment about front-loading some of the spending in education to try to offset that sales tax hike in October. All of this will help, but it's not as significant for GDP growth, so it won't fully offset the decline. However, the global outlook has improved quite significantly, and that's translated into our country risk assessment. I believe you all have our latest country risk assessment in your bags. It's this map over here. We saw more upgrades than downgrades in the third quarter of 2017. The only exception is some countries in the GCC area, and that's related to oil prices, as our speaker has rightly mentioned. However, we see overall that there's more upgrades than downgrades. Just a note of caution on our country risk assessment. It looks like a sovereign rating, so we go from A1 to E, A1 to A4 being the equivalent of investment grade, with the only difference that we are not a sovereign, we are not calculating sovereign risk. Our country risk assessment is a measure of credit risk. So it's a proxy for the likelihood that a company in that country will default on its payments or its debt. And it's based on 4 main pillars. Of course, we have the first pillar being macro forecasts, so our GDP forecasts and our inflation. We do this for all countries in the world, so we have our own GDP growth forecasting models for the main economies. For the smaller ones, we use the IMF forecasts. The second pillar is business climate. So it's very different, like the risk of a country and how easy it is to do business in a country are very different things. So to add a little bit of dimension to our assessments, we publish what we call the business climate, and it includes things not just like ease of doing business, but also how easy it is to access data on buyers in that country. We all know that for places like Vietnam, where that country has received a lot of investment from Japan, it can be daunting or challenging at times to find the data on the companies in that country. So that would reflect into a negative or more negative assessment in the business climate framework. And we also look into things such as the legal framework. So in case you do have an issue in the country, how easy it is to go through legal channels. The third pillar is a political risk model. Our global CEO mentioned this earlier during his keynote speech. We've recently issued a very comprehensive political risk model. I mean, it includes anything from the number of violent incidences in the country to Gini coefficients and inequality levels. So it's a very comprehensive indicator, and that accounts also for 25% of our methodology. And finally, being a global trade credit insurance group, we could not leave out our own payment experience. So if we do experience a series of claims in a country, that is 25% of the assessment. That brings down our country risk assessment. It's correlated for countries and sectors, so the story is similar for our sectors. We actually saw mostly upgrades, in fact, no downgrades to any of the sectors in the third quarter of this year. The main upgrades, I don't have time to go over all sectors, but we're in the ICT, in Latin America and Asia, and in the pharma sector in Western Europe. Pharma, in fact, is the sector where we are most bullish at the moment. No downgrades, but we're still fairly cautious in sectors such as metals and construction. Again, this is quite similar to a country risk assessment. So we have macro indicators. We have comments, like qualitative comments from our network, a very broad network of underwriters globally. We also have our own payment experience. So if we do experience claims in a sector in a country, that's reflected in our assessment. And you can access that information through our assessments as well. And finally, we have a very extensive list of financial indicators that we include as part of the assessment. This is also 25% of the pillar. And we forecast these 2 quarters into the future. So you can rest assured that we are looking at things like profitability, debt liquidity, and the cost of debt repayment. So we look at EBITDA over interest expense as well. Zooming in to Asia, I'm the Asia economist, so I want to discuss some of the risks in Asia in a bit more detail. We see that the situation has not improved, but it's been stable. So we saw a series of downgrades in the summer of 2016, and this was a result of the developments in China, and some countries in the region were more exposed to China through trade channels, so it was just logical to downgrade all of those countries at the same time. And while we are cautiously optimistic about the outlook, we still see some vulnerabilities, so we do not it's not the right time to implement any upgrades yet. In fact, the latest rating agency to downgrade the Chinese economy was S&P just a month ago, so I think we still need to see how things evolve. But having said that, the region is doing much better than it was a few years ago. This chart shows FX reserves. We thought it would be nice to include it, given that this year is also the 20th anniversary of the global Asian financial crisis. So here you'll see that FX reserves have actually increased quite significantly, and that has an impact on the risk of a country in 2016 compared to 1996. But it's not just FX reserves. In general, we think that the region is better positioned to endure a financial crisis or any sort of exogenous event were to happen. For example, current account surpluses have become more normal, and that's in line with this increase in FX reserves. Of course, they're included in the calculation, but also the fact that a lot of the countries in the region have trade surpluses, and savings have also increased quite significantly since 1996. The only country where the current account deficit has deteriorated, and we are concerned about that, is Indonesia. Furthermore, the region is also less exposed to outflows of capital, especially foreign money. So the foreign debt to gross national income index declined by an average of 30% between 1996 and 2016. And the only exception to that, again, is Malaysia, which, in our opinion, is the most exposed country to speculative money outflows. But this improvement in the global economy has translated. As we said, the situation in Asia is quite stable. We haven't implemented any downgrades, no upgrades either, although we do see some improvement in growth momentum. In this chart, you will see quarterly GDP forecasts for a number of countries in the region. This is year over year, so it's the first quarter 2017 compared to the first quarter 2016, and so on and so forth. And we see this momentum, this strength, continuing into the third quarter and, in fact, into the end of this year, potentially also the first quarter of 2018. Some of the GDP figures for the third quarter include China at 6.8%, just marginally lower than 6.9% in the second quarter. Singapore soared and it grew by 4.6%, which is the highest level in 7 years. And Indonesia was 5.1, slightly above the previous reading, and South Korea 3.6%. Japan is now expected to grow at 1.6%, and we expect growth in Japan to average 1.5% this year. So what is underpinning this better performance? Remember how I showed you a chart of a pendulum? This is where I start discussing factors that will bring that outlook down going forward. Here you can see that one of the main drivers, it's certainly true for Japan, but it's also true for other countries in the region, driving that improvement in performance is export growth. So exports have increased quite significantly. You'll see that a lot of countries in the region are exporting 20% more than they were during the same period last year. In this chart, we show the YOY, and it's also a 3-month moving average to try to smooth out the trend. But it's indisputable that this has increased, and it's increased quite fast. Now, where I'm from, we have a saying, and it goes, if something is too good to be true, it's not true. So we have to look into exports in a little more detail before we can assertively claim that it's part of the recovery story. So earlier in the conference, we talked about this tech boom and how exports of electronic goods and components were boosting exports, and that's certainly true, and I'm sure the fact that Apple just launched 2 new iPhones is also contributing to a cyclical increase in exports of those types of goods. However, a much less discussed story is the impact of increasing commodity prices. So when we talk about exports, we talk about exports in value terms. How many US dollars of steel or oil you export. Now, if the price of that commodity increases, we're not saying that there's no increase in demand, but there's an increase in the price of that commodity that should translate into a faster increase in export growth. And that's exactly what's happened in the region. The chart here shows the change in price of commodities throughout the whole year. This would be even steeper if we take that index further back, but we're just looking at this year for the time being. And you can see that metals in particularly are outperforming all of the other commodities in terms of price. And that's trickled down into all of the different products that are made using metals, and it's increased the price of exports throughout the value chain, which has helped, of course, the region as a whole, because Asia is one of the main manufacturing hubs, and it's where the global value chain lies. So what's driving this increase in metal prices? A lot of it is, in our opinion, related to supply-side reforms in China. There was a very important meeting taking place in Beijing in October, where Xi Jinping changed the entire composition of the Standing Politburo. And it was very important for him that everything was very smooth ahead of the event, so he could put the right people in place and ensure that he can forge ahead with reforms in the country in the next 5 years. There's talks about potentially him remaining in power for an additional 5 years. So as we can see on the table in the right-hand side, there's been an overperformance in some of the indicators, especially GDP growth. The target for this year is 6.5%. We're already at 6.9% on average. And assuming that GDP doesn't fall dramatically, it's unlikely that the growth will fall below 6.7% this year and 6.5% next year. However, this optimism surrounding the Chinese story is overrated. And in our opinion, as you can see in the chart on the left, this is part of an ongoing deceleration story. So why are we a little bit cautious or a little bit less optimistic than other people on the Chinese economy? If you look at the table on the right, there is no sign of consumer price inflation. The target for this year was 3%. However, the performance YTD is only 1.5%. And moreover, this improvement in growth has come at the expense of rising credit levels. So you can see that total social financing growth was expected to increase by 12% this year. We're already at over 16%. So the Chinese stabilization this year has come at a price, and that is rising debt. In this chart, we can see a decomposition of Chinese debt, and almost 160% of that is held by corporates. Now, why is this a problem? This is a problem because it leads to rising non-performing loans in banks. Of course, the official figure in China is 1.74. It's been 1.74 for, I think, the last 10 years. But non-official forecasts put this estimate at around 5 to, in the worst case scenario, 10% of total bank loans. If you have an increase in non-performing loans, what happens is that banks tend to either not lend out, or they have liquidity concerns, or it could even lead to a full-fledged financial crisis. The fact that you have such a significant increase in debt, and it's all going to state-owned firms, means that the macro fundamentals for the companies are also deteriorating. And it's also higher debt leads to higher costs of debt service. So we can see that there's been an increase in the interest cover, which is the EBIT over interest expense, for certain sectors, especially metals, energy, chemicals, and construction, which is in line with our assessments that we saw in some slides before. Now, with the meetings out of the way, we believe that the Chinese authorities will do certain things to try to limit these financial vulnerabilities. One of the biggest debates in the past weeks was surrounding nominal GDP growth. Nominal GDP growth was quite high, and it came out at 11.2% in the last quarter. And a lot of that narrative was basically tried to convince the readers that the Chinese economy could deflate its way out of debt. Two things. The first thing is that credit is still growing faster than nominal GDP. On the chart on the left, you can see that outstanding credit, that's the line in blue, is increasing faster than nominal GDP. So this growth story will not be able to resolve the corporate indebtedness issue. And the second point is that if we look at the deflator increased by 4%, but if we look at what's driving that inflation, it's not consumer price inflation, it's mostly producer price inflation. That increased by 6.9% in the last quarter, and a lot of that producer price inflation is related to an increase in metal prices. We have a chart that shows, it's not in here unfortunately, but the correlation between producer price inflation, metal prices, and industrial profits. And it all goes in the same direction. So part of the reason for implementing or forging ahead with these supply-side reforms, trying to reduce that steel capacity, was to boost prices, to increase the deflator in the GDP equation, to try to increase nominal GDP growth and make it easier for companies to at least contain indebtedness ahead of those meetings. That's not sustainable. The closures in capacity are not permanent, and so we expect PPI deflation to taper down, which completely disrupts this growth narrative. In sum, if they want to do more to address corporate debt, they need to continue to allow defaults. We saw an increase in defaults in China in 2016, quite a steep one, and that continued into 2017 and then stopped after the first quarter. Now we expect that to continue picking up in the future. The second point is on the housing sector. If you can see on the right-hand side, that's housing prices in China. The authorities have implemented a series of measures to curb property speculation in Tier 1 cities. That means Beijing, Shanghai, and Shenzhen, and that's the blue line that goes down very steeply. However, if you look at the gray line, Tier 2 cities, it's continued to increase. So a combination of an increase in prices in second-tier cities, fiscal stimulus, so construction in infrastructure investments, etc., have cushioned the impact of the decline in housing prices on the real economy. But it's likely that this decline will catch up with real growth going forward, because the housing sector accounts directly and indirectly for about a third of Chinese growth. Finally, I have two more slides left. This slide shows increasing indebtedness in Asia as a region. So I just wanted to highlight that some of the problems that we see in China are not exclusive to China. In fact, this corporate debt and household debt has become an issue for a number of economies in the region. This shows the change in household debt to GDP levels between 2007 and 2015. And we can see that globally, this increase was led by Thailand, and Malaysia, and China. So in addition to corporate debt, we see high levels of household debt. And what that means is, in case of an exogenous event, in case that major central banks decide to taper liquidity going forward, the cost of borrowing money or the cost of paying back for that debt by households will increase, which will cripple domestic consumption in all of these countries that are trying to move away from industrial investments and secondary sector growth to a more service-oriented economy. So this will be one of the main risks going forward. Last but not least, so we've looked into a lot of the risk factors that continue to remain in the economy, and there's a lot of talk of tapering actually already happening. In fact, BOJ is arguably already doing a technical taper because they're buying a less proportion of JGBs than they were last year. And however, despite the fact that these vulnerabilities continue to remain, we've seen valuations go over the roof, and volatility levels remain at historic lows. So the conclusion of this presentation is that whatever comes up must come down again, and we live in an increasingly interconnected economy where investors have become complacent and are not reacting accordingly to potential sources of risk, such as political risk or financial vulnerabilities. So when there is a correction, the downturn will be felt more strongly than before. Thank you so much.